Let's get started, everyone. Thanks for coming. Last A16 crypto research seminar of the week. We've got our very own Scott Kominers, who will be telling us about redistributive allocation mechanisms. Before we get started, let me just mention that Mohammed Akbarpour, who's his first co-author, he'll actually be visiting us, I believe it's the week after next. So he'll be hanging out here. So that's another thing to look forward to. So Scott, all yours.
Excellent. Thanks so much. Thrilled to be, back here presenting a second time this week. Very different format of talk. No audio at the beginning or anything. This is a formal research talk. But as with the other, I love participation and comments and questions and stuff. So feel free to just ask questions or shout them out. Raise your hand. Type them in the chat. I'll be monitoring all of these things at once. And economists are very used to having lots of questions during their talks. So please do discuss. And then let me also shout out, Mohammed Akbarpour, who Tim just mentioned, is going to be visiting the group, and Pyotr Dvorak. These guys are both totally extraordinary. While our names are in certified random order, in some Shapley value sense, you should apportion more than 2/3 of the credit for this agenda to the two of them, because it could never have happened without either of them, but it could have happened without me. So if you take the marginal contributions of all the sub-coalitions, like when you compute the Shapley value, more of the density falls on their sub-coalitions. In any event, so this is a paper that I started writing, 4 maybe years ago, like a long time ago, in especially relative to typical timelines in CS, and it didn't start as a crypto paper. In fact, it was a time when I wasn't aware of a lot of sort of the modern consumer crypto applications that I study these days. But as we'll talk about, sort of throughout and especially at the end, it actually turns out to be highly germane for a couple of crypto applications. The starting observation is that many goods and services are allocated using non-market mechanisms, even though monetary transfers are available. So we frequently do non-market allocation. This comes up in housing markets and healthcare, sort of food. Think about in-kind food transfers like food stamps. Commercial applications include event tickets. I guess park permits are not exactly a commercial application, but they're sort of more commercial than those other three, because they're definitely not essential goods in some sense. Unlike housing, healthcare, and food. But event tickets, we see artists selling tickets to concerts at much lower than what would be market clearing prices. And we all just saw this play out worldwide with vaccines as well. So despite the fact that some people would have had exceedingly high willingness to pay to get vaccinated early against COVID-19, in practice, the US and virtually every other country in the world used some, sort of priority system, where they, sort of allocated early vaccines to healthcare workers, other sorts of frontline workers, like people in grocery stores, and also people who were at especially high risk, so the elderly, immunocompromised, and so forth. And that's despite the fact that you could, in principle, have used a market allocation, and some people would have had very, very high willingness to pay. So these are all contexts where we see non-market mechanisms being used. This also crops up in our crypto world. We see it frequently with NFTs, where assets are sold typically at far below market clearing prices, and sometimes, sometimes via constrained sale mechanisms via waitlists, and sometimes just in public sales at below market clearing prices. And we see gas wars and other sorts of, competition to gain access as a result. And this is this last bullet point is a little bit more speculative, because I don't know of an example of it, although we had talked about doing such a thing in Diem. You could imagine that if you have a semi-permission network, you actually care a lot about, say, the geographic distribution of your validators, right? For some sort of physical robustness to different forms of disaster or attack. And so you might in fact be willing to offer more attractive terms to someone who's willing to run a node in a location that would otherwise not be part of your system, or inside of a nonprofit institution or something of the sort. And so once again, you could imagine a situation where the organizer of the market would prefer to use a non-market allocation to do distribution, or at least a partially non-market allocation. You might have different market clearing prices depending on some of the characteristics of the participants, or you might just sort of sell units at different prices depending on sort of an early sale, a late sale, with different probabilities of getting the good. But so looking at this as an economist, we're sort of left scratching our heads, right? Like, these are all high value goods, or at least some NFTs are high value goods. Why not use a market mechanism, which at least in principle should lead to more efficient outcomes, at least as measured by, people's willingness to pay? And one answer that we see often and that we see in all of these contexts, phrased slightly differently, is redistributive concerns, right? We have in-kind transfers of housing and healthcare and food because we think these are essential goods, and often people's low willingness to pay for them is not a signal of low demand, but rather a signal of low ability to pay. We think it's important for them to have access, even though they don't necessarily have the ability to pay for them. In the context of event tickets, the highest willingness to pay agents, again, it might be driven by ability to pay as well as value, and those might not be the ones that have the sort of greatest positive externalities for the concert. So, for example, a friend of mine told me about an instance in which, effectively an entire Pitbull concert was filled with McKinsey consultants, as a McKinsey event. And while like McKinsey has a, very high willingness to pay for Pitbull tickets, this turned out to be like a pretty low energy Pitbull concert because you fill an entire, I think people are laughing. Zoom filters laughter, but I think some people might be laughing. That's good. It turns out to be a pretty low energy Pitbull concert. If you fill the room full of McKinsey consultants, you don't have any well, we won't characterize why perhaps, this sort of wasn't optimal. But artists often try and keep prices low as a way of getting, sort of their true high energy fans into the room.
Question.
Please.
So can you clarify what you mean by non-market? Like, what's the difference between like free market, market with quotas and tariffs versus non-market? Yeah,
so we'll make this very precise in a few slides. But in this context, we're going to be talking about pricing that's sort of like not, that doesn't result in assortative, matching on willingness to pay. So some sort of like price constraint with rationing or randomization. We often in these contexts also see, sort of totally unpriced allocation, right? So you might allocate like event tickets, by sort of a full lottery at price zero or something. That's sort of a special case of the price zero. We're going to have transfers that's sort of like fixing the price at zero, but like we're not talking about very complex zero priced prioritization schemes like you might see in the context of a two-sided or of a matching based sort of allocation without money model. But there again, I think the core intuition is the same. The decision about like, do you want to use a non-market mechanism comes from some redistributive preference. You care a lot about the types of people who receive the good. And here we're going to be thinking about doing that redistribution through a pricing system with potentially with rationing, but you can also do that via various forms of direct priority scheme. Does that help?
Yeah.
Awesome. Further questions? All right. So the model today is actually going to be a one-sided model because it's going to make the dynamics we're talking about clearer. But let me just quickly like present some intuition that at least for me, is really helpful in thinking about what's going on. And we have another paper called Redistribution Through Markets, which matches this supply-demand curve I'm about to show you a little bit better. And with apologies, I'm like going back to Econ 101, but like this is a little wacky. I'm going to show you an Econ 101 picture and point out something that has always been in this picture, but I myself had never noticed until I started working on this agenda with Mohammed and Piotr. But it's sort of like very essential in how we think about the use of market clearing mechanisms. So here's a classic supply and demand curve. I am terrible at pictures. This is true. So I have to remind myself what the heck it says. So supply curve slopes up, demand curve slopes down. Good. You can think about every point on the supply curve as representing an agent, right? So this is somebody who's like, value, opportunity cost or cost of selling is that point. And up here, it's, it's a higher cost. So we've like got somebody else who has a higher cost of selling. Buyers, similarly up here, this is someone who values the good at this number. This is somebody who values the good at this number. And why do we pick the market clearing price? Well, it maximizes the area of this triangle, right? If we push the price above market clearing instead, we introduce two inefficiencies. One of them is this triangle here. It's called the Deadweight Loss triangle. These are trades that the market would bear, but that don't happen, right? Here's a person with willingness to pay above that seller's cost of selling, and we don't have them trade because the price is too high. The second inefficiency, which isn't sort of as visually clean, is this dashed line. There's more people who want to sell at this price than want to buy. And so we have to do some rationing. We don't necessarily pick the most efficient sellers. So those are the two allocative distortions. The nice thing about market clearing pricing, is it saves us from both of those distortions, right? We get rid of the Deadweight Loss triangle and supply and demand clear perfectly, so we don't have to do any rationing. But note also in this picture is that blue box, right? So there's also a transfer from buyer surplus to seller surplus, right? Here it's red, here it's blue. And if for some reason we thought that the people in our market, the sellers in our market, were high social welfare value relative to buyers, right? If we cared about getting money to the sellers enough, we might be happy with this allocative distortion in exchange for an improvement in equity, right? And improve for like the transfer value of the market and getting some value from the buyers who buy to the sellers who sell. And again, as I say, we're going to be talking about, one-sided markets today, but like, this is the core idea that like somehow we're going to be more okay with market distortions that distort away from allocative efficiency when they serve a really strong welfare purpose. But of course, if we just knew precisely who we were trying to target and could target them, then we don't need to use, market forces quite as much to figure out like, who we want to target. But some information, especially, think how the more anonymous your participants are, the less information you have about them, the more you actually might need to use people's behavior as a way of screening their level of need. And even if you do know who they are, their behavior might screen some levels, can identify some levels of need that you might not be able to observe like particularly easily. So like think back to the start of the pandemic. At the start of the pandemic, it became much more dangerous to drive for rideshare companies in some abstract, hard to understand way, right? Like respiratory pandemic, clearly having a bunch of people come in and out of your car is a dangerous thing to do. We don't quite know how dangerous, but like rideshare got more dangerous more or less overnight. And yet a bunch of people started driving for rideshare for the very first time. And the way to think about what was going on there is presumably not that these people were risk-seeking and like hoping to catch COVID as early as possible, but rather that, rideshare is a market with free entry. And at that precise moment, they had an idiosyncratic cash need that meant being able to enter into this market was valuable to them, right? And that might be that like, they were just furloughed from their job, or, they had a family member who got ill, so they needed extra cash in the short run. And so in that sense, rideshare markets by, sort of like at the start of the pandemic, especially, were selecting for sellers through their behavior who were higher need on average. And so distorting the price, sort of bumping, in that case, bumping up the price a little bit would effect a pretty high social welfare transfer from buyers to sellers, especially because buyers are pretty price inelastic. So the size of that deadweight loss triangle isn't actually that big. And so through the market, you can sort of identify, agents, where the transfer role of the market is actually sort of a powerful social welfare tool. And again, maybe some of those things the market, the government or sort of whoever the tax authority is could eventually pick up, right? Eventually, that someone's been furloughed from their job, but the market could sort of like respond immediately in a way that that a government allocation can't necessarily. And then again, this like you have a sick family member thing is maybe information the market can learn about you that you can never like sort of credibly communicate to a government.
Scott, I had a question. This
Please.
Example, you're distorting the price, right?
Mm-hmm.
Does the picture look different if you distort the quantity instead? If you say like only X transfers can happen, but the price can be freely set, or is it the same picture?
It's probably about the same picture, right? Like if you, I guess it depends a little bit on the way in which the market adjusts following a change in quantity. But if you like, fixing price so that this is the market clearing quantity and fixing the quantity to equal this market clearing quantity should lead to that being the market clearing price, modulo like general equilibrium adjustment. So I think it's effectively the same there. We're going to see that in-kind redistribution is not always the most efficient way to redistribute. You might find that you actually want to raise a lot of revenue in the market and then just redistribute that as like a lump sum transfer. And so there are various types of distortions you might want, and they don't all look like ones that could be implemented through sort of redistribution through the quantity lever. But like in this case, I think they're basically equivalent. Further thoughts or questions? Great questions. All right. So what are we going to do today? So as I mentioned, that two-sided example is sort of for framing intuition. We have another paper that sort of like matches that a little bit more directly. It's called Redistribution Through Markets. Today, we're going to be looking at a one-sided allocation framework with redistributive concerns. And importantly, as I've already hinted, we're going to be taking this market design perspective. So this is not public finance. This is we control only a single market. We're either a regulator who oversees that market, or we're just the market designer. We run the marketplace platform or something of the sort. And we're going to be allocating goods of heterogeneous quality, differing in observed and unobserved, to agents rather, differing in observed and unobserved characteristics. And so we're going to have like a curve of qualities, and which could also, I guess, be interpreted as like a probability of receiving the good. And the agents are going to be sort of have some observable labels and then some unobserved characteristics, both like an unobserved willingness to pay and an unobserved social welfare weight. We're going to solve the optimal mechanism design problem under incentive and individual rationality constraints. And crucially, those welfare weights are going to enter into our objective function. So we're going to be doing optimal allocation with respect to what we can learn about the welfare weights, because those are unobserved. As you'll see, we're actually going to have to be drawing inferences from agents' types and their behavior as to what those welfare weights actually are. And what the main takeaway from the paper is a framework for thinking about when you want to use some degree of redistributive allocation versus not. And the key factors that drive this turn out to be the interaction between the social preferences as reflected in those welfare weights and agents the agent's observable characteristics. The role of revenue generated by the mechanism. So like how much you care about revenue versus improving welfare through the mechanism directly. So for example, if you can make really efficient lump sum transfers, right? If I can, if there's some set of agents I really, really care about, but I can raise like, money from the mechanism and then buy them some really, really useful public good, then maybe I still don't want to do redistributive allocation because I want to raise as much money as possible and then use that revenue to improve welfare. And then last, it'll turn out a little bit to depend on sort of properties of the good itself. So like it only makes sense to use a good for in-kind transfers when that good is sort of universally desirable. This is like, if I have, I don't know, got to be really careful. What's a good that's not universally desirable? Pick your favorite really, really ugly sweater. It doesn't make sense to give people in-kind transfers of super ugly sweaters because that may not actually be valuable to them in a way that like causes the that causes us to be able to sort of shift welfare by lowering price. But that's a different story. We'll talk about it a little bit later.
I have a question.
So that's where we're going. Yes.
For the heterogeneous quality, does that mean that different people care about different items, like different amounts, or that like everybody agrees that like each item is like what its value is at?
Everyone is going to have a personal, like an individual specific willingness to pay for quality, and then the quality levels are agreed upon by everybody. So there might be like a good healthcare program, like a really, really like sort of strong healthcare system and a medium healthcare system and a weaker healthcare system. You might have a different shadow value of healthcare quality, but everyone agrees that the really good one is really good. Everyone agrees the medium one is medium, and they just put different weights on it. And indeed, your willingness to pay is going to interact linearly. That will actually be important for our machinery, although I think not important for the messages. Okay, not to belabor related literature too much, but let me just quickly flag. First of all, there's a lot of it, but first of all, like there's a sort of folk theorem in economic theory that every idea in economic theory is an echo of a classical result from the golden era of theory. And indeed, this is true of this entire research agenda as well. Marty Weitzman had this beautiful paper back in the 70s that posed the idea that you might want to use rationing instead of market clearing pricing when you're concerned about equity in addition to efficiency, right? When you have some agents with less ability to pay, fully market clearing pricing, competitive equilibrium might not be welfare maximizing. This is, as I mentioned, also the sort of the tune we pick up in our other paper, Redistribution Through Markets. And then, sort of methodologically, what we're talking about today, sort of under the hood, is building a lot on, sort of like really leaning heavily on these ideas by Condorelli from 2013. And then, sort of the story around why we want in-kind transfers in this context is sort of going to be very, sort of like a mechanism design flavor of a story that we see in public finance as well. That basically, sometimes we can screen people. They call it self-targeting. It's also called that in the economic development literature. Sometimes we can use people's behavior to screen how much welfare we put on them in a market. And then footnote, this also, like, we're going to see mechanisms that look very similar to what you see in frameworks with budget constrained bidders. Slightly different reason, but there's a sense in which there's a relationship, because these budget constraints are sort of like an infinite shadow value on cash past a certain point. All right. So without further ado, let's set up a model. We are going to be allocating a unit mass of objects to a unit mass of agents. As I mentioned, each object can have a quality, and this was a precise answer to your question. So the qualities are just this, sort of distribution of qualities. And agent types are, comprise a label, a willingness to pay for quality, and an unobserved social welfare weight. So the designer knows the type distribution, but crucially does not observe the social welfare weights for the individual agents. And note that if an agent of type IR lambda receives a good with quality Q and pays T, then her utility is going to be QR minus T. So that's how quality interacts with willingness to pay. So you have like a linear fixed willingness to pay for quality. And your contribution to social welfare is that value, but multiplied by lambda. Everyone okay so far?
So Scott, could you talk about, like, it looks like I should not think of T as a transfer in the traditional sense. Is that right? Or
no, I think T is a transfer in the traditional sense. Okay. We just have a welfare function that has weighted utility by lambda, but T is part of your utility. So you receive a transfer in your quasi-linear utility function, but the social planner puts shadow value of that transfer lambda.
Okay, and so transfers, I guess, need not cancel out in the overall calculation because of the.
We are going to require a full budget balance. So the transfers in T are going to cancel out. But indeed, as what you're saying, sort of the net value of a transfer can be positive, right? So I can take $1 from somebody super wealthy and give it to somebody who's very impoverished, and that has a net positive return to social welfare, whereas like under a normal model, it would be neutral.
I'm not sure I completely understand why utility is like Q times R when you're not paying anything.
It's Q times R when you're not paying anything. Well, it's if you receive a good of quality Q and pay T. So if you receive the good for free, you of quality Q, then you get Q times R and pay 0. But in general, the allocation is going to involve you paying something for the good of quality Q. So it's not that your value is QR always. It's like you got the object of quality Q and your willingness to pay for quality is R.
Okay. So
note, by the way, that you can implement like people not getting the good just by having some objects of quality actually 0, right? This is a closed interval.
Yeah, I just think of R as like a amount to pay per quality.
Per unit quality, exactly. Okay. It's a willingness to pay per unit quality. And as I say, like I don't actually think any of the core qualitative dynamics I'm talking about are going to change if we instead they made that concave, but they would just sort of get compressed. And machinery wise, it's actually like we're leaning on the linearity to be able to like to sharply characterize the optimal mechanism. Cool. All right, and then again, quick reminder, like I is the observable. So this might be like the neighborhood you live in, or like your holdings of a certain NFT. It's like whatever we can expect, it might be your income if we're the government. It's whatever we can observe and verify about you. Unobserved willingness to pay is like your sort of individual private value for quality. And then lambda, again, is the thing that actually affects the welfare function, but we can't observe it directly. So we have to infer it from I and R. So we have access to arbitrary direct allocation mechanisms. We insist on sort of pardon the lots of notation. I figure it's good for the video to actually give the formalism, but these are all the standard constraints as you expect them. Feasibility, we have to like allocate the qualities we have. Incentive compatibility, we have to elicit values truthfully. IR, we can't make people worse off by putting them in the mechanism, and non-negative transfers. So we're going to sort of insist that we not run a deficit. One interesting footnote here, because lambda influences and objective, the designer is going to maximize a weighted sum of revenue and utility. So alpha times the sort of net transfer plus lambda times, sort of dotted with this utility vector across all the different agents. One important note is because lambda affects the designer's utility, but not the individual's. If we tried to elicit lambda directly, people would just tell us what we wanted to hear, right? If we asked them, like, are you the person who's high, sort of social welfare weight? They would say, of course I am, obviously. If in fact we were going to use that in the mechanism. So essentially we're limited to eliciting R and imputing lambda under incentive compatibility. And so indeed, without loss of optimality, we can make the allocation and transfers depend only on R and I, but not on lambda directly. And so instead of like just directly eliciting lambda and plugging into the welfare function, because like, again, people will tell us whatever lambda they think we actually want to hear, because because it gets them a better outcome and doesn't affect their utility. The designer is going to have to work with the expected social welfare weight given I and R. So economically, what we're really doing is we're estimating the need of agents given what we can see about them and what we can elicit about them. And so the optimal mechanism is going to declare, and really the optimal allocation is going to depend on the degree of correlation between the labels and the willingness to pay with the unobserved welfare weights. So
Scott,
yep, go for it.
So what if the lambdas were just known? Would this just be like a straightforward problem?
Sorry, if the labels were just what?
The lambdas were public.
The lambdas. Oh, yeah. So if the lambda, so we still might ask, like, how do we do the allocation given the lambdas? And there's a I guess a greedy algorithm or something you would use to do it. But it definitely gets easier. So if, for example, like lambda equaled I, right? So if every I like perfectly identified your lambda, then we might still decide, we'd still be deciding within group. And in fact, actually, how far am I from? Let me explain this slide and then I'll answer your question, because like I want to reference the thing here. So the way we find the optimal mechanism, which I'm not going to belabor, in the talk today, but the details are cool. And as I mentioned, like, major shout outs to Condorelli for a lot of the machinery. But there's sort of two steps. So there's like an allocation across and within groups. The cross group allocation is basically going to be a greedy algorithm conditioning on what the within group allocation is. And the greedy algorithm is sort of going to be like, allocating each marginal unit of quality to where it has the highest sort of expected social return. And then the within group is going to be sort of optimal allocation given that label. And we might find that we want to sort people on willingness to pay. We might find that we want to do fully random allocation. We might find we want to do something in the middle, but it's whatever is sort of like, welfare optimal within that group. If the lambdas were sort of completely known from the group allocation, that actually gets very easy, right? It turns out that like a lot of the allocation questions depend on the average social welfare weight. We'd basically, we'd still be doing a version of this type of allocation, right? Like it's possible that we might have really, really high lambdas within a group, but some agents with really low value for the good. And so we might still give some units to one lambda and then some units to another lambda and go back and forth. But it's true, we'd have much less than we need to actually elicit, right? We could sort of, sort everybody by lambda and then just decide sort of cutoffs in each group for each pricing scheme or something like that.
Could you go back, just pause on the models, the previous slide?
This one or two back?
This one. Can you, I think I missed this on the very first slide. I refers to a single player, or I is like a demographic?
I is a demographic. So an agent is an IR lambda. Sorry, that's
fine. And then
right. That's actually like kind of clunky notations I had not thought of previously. Although it has the advantage, you can say like, IR lambda, like IR baboon for anybody who watched that old cartoon. But let's it's a crypto talk, I have to make at least one totally random reference. But yeah, so the I is actually like your demographic type, and it could be a very rich demographic type. It could be your neighborhood, your income, your like, I don't know, your profession. Like, you know, in the context of vaccine allocation, we think of this as encoding your profession, your like general risk factor, your age, all of that stuff.
And then also just to make sure, so for non-negative transfers, that actually means you're not allowed to just say like, high lambda people, you're gonna get money from low lambda people. Or like
no, this is a net transfer. So we can do some amount of that, but it's manifested through alpha here, right? So we can raise money. So if alpha is like higher than the average Pareto, the average lambda in some group, or the average Pareto weight in some group, we can sort of raise money through a transfer, and then like alpha sort of reflects giving that away as like a public good or something like that. But this is stopping us from just like this, I guess, plus the IR constraint are stopping us from just like taking a ton of money from people and giving them nothing in return.
Got it.
Yeah, and in some sense, not only are we tying our hands to only one market, like so we're only sort of designing a single market, we're also turning off just sort of like redistributive taxation power. To the extent that we're doing something, you know, redistributive with cash, it has to be cash earned through the mechanism by selling the good. Which again, in a lot of these contexts we're thinking about seems reasonable, right? Like the National Park Service doesn't have the ability to look at go and tax people randomly, nor does the typical NFT mint.
And then can you go one forward again?
One forward, yep.
Or maybe two. Sorry, where you settled here. So then how are things possibly going to be allocated? So when you say allocate within group refers to just I.
Yeah.
Right. And then so when you say allocate within group, you just mean that's based on R. Because that's
correct.
You can possibly use besides I.
Yep.
Okay. Okay, sorry. So this is not like obvious that you can do these two separate, or is this like it's not obvious that you should be able to break it down like this?
Correct. Yeah. This is not obvious.
I mean, is it obvious that this is like something you could do and the only remaining question is optimality, or is it?
Yeah, so it's sure. I mean, because for any distribution of qualities to a group, you can solve the optimal allocation problem, right? It's some mixture of like, you know, assortative matching at some pricing and rationing, right? So for any allocation of qualities to groups, I can tell you the optimal way to distribute those qualities within each group. And so then it turns out that that sort of gives rise to this like sort of expected social return of giving the marginal unit to a given group. Because you know, for each unit, if you think of just like peeling off the quality distribution, we know from, I don't know, more or less like simpler mechanism design, like who's going to get that unit if we give it to each group. And so we know the expected social return of giving it to each given group. And so we can just now greedily allocate on the basis of that.
See. Sorry, so then, okay, so maybe obvious is too strong of a word, but you can say whatever allocation you eventually use, just project it onto each group. Whatever you do, project it onto each group, better be optimal within that group.
Correct.
And so now, since that has more structure, just write that down and optimize over that directly.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Yeah, that's a nice way of framing it, actually. Indeed. There's this sort of like dual question of like, could you do it in like, could you do it sort of in reverse? Like basically like, you know, price the qualities like sort of per label or something, but indeed like, you basically then have to keep, you're basically end up doing this again, just sort of, you know, in inverted like coordinate space, because you have to like keep track of a different available price for each label as you move through the quality distribution. Cool. All right, but so the really important question is actually sort of like, what does the shape of the mechanism look like? And so the fact that the optimal mechanism has this like really simple structure means we can actually ask of the solution sort of when you want to use each, when you want to use in-kind versus market allocation. So when do you use in-kind redistribution, which will mean in this context random allocation at some range of a same range of quality levels at a below market clearing price. And the answer is going to be, you roughly want to do this when you have some way of uncovering inequality in the unobserved welfare weights. And there are two ways that this can happen. One of them is what we call label revealed inequalities. This is when you just know that like in a given group, you actually want to, sort of transfer more utility to everyone in that group. So when the average Pareto weight on group I, so that's that like average expected lambda, exceeds the weight on revenue, it's optimal to do at least some in-kind redistribution to that group for the case of universally desirable goods. These are goods for which even the lowest type wants the good. A special case of that is essential goods. So like food stamps or public housing. Here, like, you have some eligible group, and it makes sense to do in-kind redistribution because we care about sort of transferring value to that group. I'll show you the formal statement about that in a second, but it's not so much in this context about giving them the good, giving them utility by way of giving them the good, but by doing like pooling some units of the good at the bottom, we can actually lower price to the entire group. The second reason you might want to do in-kind redistribution is when there's what we call willingness to pay revealed inequalities. This is when the welfare weights are strongly and negatively correlated with willingness to pay. So think here, healthcare. This is like, that, someone is only willing to pay, sort of $500 for some super important medical treatment. The inference there is not that they don't want the super important medical treatment, but they probably have very little ability to pay for it. So low willingness to pay for essential healthcare leads us to infer that you actually probably have high social welfare weight. You're probably sort of impoverished or otherwise in high need. And so there again, we might want in-kind redistribution because it's a way of transferring to those agents who we infer through their behavior are actually high need.
Isn't that, Scott, wouldn't that be vulnerable to manipulation though? Because like anybody can manipulate their willingness to pay down as that this is what you're doing.
Yeah, so it has to be done in a way that is incentive compatible, which is actually very important, right? So we're pooling some quality levels. So you're going to get lower quality at this lower price. And so, but the pooling and the pricing has to work out precisely so that like really high types don't want to mimic the low type. So yes, exactly. So like, and this is in fact a problem with lots of public housing programs. So there are a lot of places like Amsterdam, for example, where the public housing has historically been so good that even the very wealthy people would like to have it if they can. And so as a result, you end up with sort of the wrong people claiming the transfer. And so indeed, you actually within group are going to get sort of these willingness to pay revealed inequality people are going to get access to higher quality goods than they would get at the market clearing price, but lower quality than others, for incentive concern reasons. Or lower expected quality because it's random allocation. Okay, so just formally, what does this look like? So label revealed inequality, as I mentioned, is that the average Pareto weight in a group is strictly larger than the weight on revenue alpha, and the good is universally desirable. So lowest type places, has positive willingness to pay. Then there's some cutoff so that we want a random allocation at a price of 0 for all types below that cutoff. Now, one intuition for this could be that we're just giving sort of those agents welfare by giving them stuff for free, but that's actually not what's going on here. What's really driving this, because remember in this group we want everybody to do better, right? This is the average Pareto weight for the entire group. We care about giving welfare to everyone rather than just the people with low willingness to pay. Here, it's that a random allocation for free lets us lower prices for everybody, right? By pooling a bunch of prices, sort of objects at a lower average quality, sort of by, at the bottom, we're sort of pricing at the average quality in that pool rather than the top on the margin. And that means we can lower the price that everybody else faces sort of to the extent that we have an assortative allocation at the top. Meanwhile, there's this willingness to pay revealed inequality as well. This is the one where we care about the people with a really low willingness to pay in particular. And you can write out the exact condition. It's going to look actually pretty familiar. Has a virtual value component in it, just with these sort of compared to these sort of social welfare weights for the transfer. Assortative matching is going to turn out to be suboptimal if willingness to pay is strongly negatively correlated with welfare weights, as I said. So the converse question is, when do we want to use market mechanisms? So when instead do we want assortative matching at market clearing prices? And this sounds almost tautological, but let me then try and convince you in 2 bullet points. It's actually not as tautological as it sounds. Roughly this wants to happen when the revenue and efficiency motives dominate versus redistributive concerns, when somehow we care more about alpha and or overall efficiency than redistribution. But the question is, when does that happen? So there are 2 contexts. One of them is about revenue maximization. So this is just when alpha is high. And remember, this doesn't necessarily mean we're a for-profit entity. It might mean that we just can do something really socially valuable with that alpha that's sort of effectively a transfer to everyone. So if the weight on revenue is above the average Pareto weight on some group, we want at least some assortative matching. And that's gonna happen when your buyers are sort of low Pareto weight in the first place. So think corporations, or as I said, when lump sum transfers are feasible. Oops, sorry. The other context is efficiency maximization. Again, this sounds almost tautological, but we can say something precise about what it means here, which is kind of interesting. When is efficiency maximization optimal in this framework? It's when the welfare weights do not correlate with willingness to pay, when we're not within a group, but we're not inferring anything from people's willingness to pay that tells us about welfare. So that's when there's either a small dispersion in welfare weights to begin with, so just everyone in the group is equal, or we don't care, we have sort of uniform welfare weights over the population. But also it could be that there are a large dispersion of welfare weights, so there's big differences in people's ability to pay, or their income or their level of need, but it isn't correlated with willingness to pay. So I think this is like bottles of milk, right? If somebody's not willing to pay $1 for a bottle of milk, our inference is typically not that they're super impoverished, but rather that they just don't like milk. And so in a market, in many ordinary scale markets, we actually, even if we wanted to do redistributive allocation, we couldn't, because we're not learning anything about the welfare weights from people's willingness to pay. Right? We could subsidize milk for populations where we can see in observables that we want to subsidize them, but we can't sort of do redistributive pricing within a group because the willingness to pay just tells us people's tastes.
Yes, you didn't include the case where there is very strong positive correlation between willingness to pay and the weight. Is that because that's obvious, or that's because it's not true?
No, that one's straightforward. So if there's really strong positive correlation between welfare weights and willingness to pay, both of these push in the direction of, it's good for revenue to do market pricing, and it's good for welfare to do market pricing. You might, yeah, up to the average Pareto weight. So that's within group. You might still have some amount of, sort of redistributive allocation across the group somehow. Cool. Okay, just in the interest of time, this is the statement of the assortative matching at the top. Yeah, I mean, this is pretty close to that statement. Basically, if the revenue maximization motive dominates for high enough types, that of course you want some amount of assortative matching. Same thing if the efficiency maximization motive dominates for high enough types. But then, sort of, we've talked a lot now about the within group distribution. Let me quickly say something about the across distribution. So here's something that's a little bit that I would not have sort of I was surprised about as we were working on, but mechanism design concerns actually make sort of totally clear ex post. So let's imagine now that we have 2 groups, and then in group 1, we're doing assortative matching, and in group 2, we're doing fully random matching. So there's one group that's all market pricing and one group that's sort of all in-kind transfer. You can ask the question of which units do you want to send to which groups? And the answer is a little bit, surprising. So the natural conjecture, and often what we do in practice, is we send the lowest quality objects to the group that gets, the in-kind transfer. But in fact, from a mechanism design perspective, what you'd really like to do is eke more revenue out of group 1 And the way to do that is to have higher dispersion in quality within that group. So you actually want to send like middle quality objects to as the in-kind transfer and use the top and bottom quality objects, sort of for the assortative matching group.
Can I ask one quick question?
Please.
I don't remember if I missed an assumption on lambda, but I think if I remember correctly, you said lambda also multiplies how much you suffer from payments.
How much the welfare metric suffers from your payments.
How much the welfare metric suffers from payments.
Yep.
Is it possible that even when you're doing the assortative matching, you don't want to raise a lot of revenue because the welfare metric gets destroyed by people with super high lambda, even though I care about adding revenue?
Yeah, probably. You may be limited in your ability to collect not that much welfare in assortative matching because the incentive constraint forces you to have a price gradient. That's kind of back to this case, I guess, right? It's like, how does your weight on revenue compare to your average Pareto weight in a given group?
Oh, I see. Okay, so you're saying there's actually a lot baked into that, which is that you would never be in a situation where that happened and you were doing the welfare maximizing matching. Okay, so you're saying that there's a lot that goes into that aside from just intuition you put at the bottom.
Correct, and indeed, like, so this is, and you might still have some degree of assortative matching at the top, but because all this result tells us is that we want some amount of random allocation at the bottom. The reason we want the random allocation at the bottom is precisely because it lets us lower prices to everybody while maintaining incentive compatibility.
Got it.
That's actually like a more precise, it's a very precise intuition for why you actually use the random allocation to lower prices for everyone. Because you couldn't, even if you wanted to lower prices to everyone at the top, you can't just do that because you lose the incentive constraint. In the last couple of minutes, I just want to say a little bit about policy. I'm going to talk about, government policy for a second, and then talk about NFT mint policy. So looking at the world with this sort of logic changes the way we think about a lot of sort of non-market versus market allocation mechanisms. So an early case, another early pandemic example, something that happened in March 2020 was a bunch of people went to dollar stores, bought all the hand sanitizer, and then started selling it on Amazon and eBay for 400x markups, 40 to 400x, I guess, markups. And this was, sort of people were very upset. They referred to this as price gouging. Some of these people have since been prosecuted. But like to an economist at first blush, that sounds sort of strange. It's like, well, people's willingness to pay was very high. If they were able to sell these things for $40 a bottle when they bought them for $1, like that's markets working, isn't it? So in the frame of this paper, you can sort of realize that that's like a really regressive allocation, right? Like at the start of the pandemic, everyone thought they needed a lot of hand sanitizer. And, it started out pretty evenly distributed across the country. And if anything, buying it from dollar stores, which are often in lower income areas, and selling it to people with high ability to pay, right? Sort of willingness to pay of $40 was not reflective necessarily of like a especially high demand relative to others, but just like a greater ability and access to pay large amounts for it on an internet platform. And if anything, the need was probably greater in those low income communities where people were more often having to go in person to jobs, take public transit and so forth. And so this is like a really regressive reallocation of the goods. Meanwhile, food stamps, which are, sort of people have criticized for, sort of providing in-kind transfers to individuals, actually food stamps are really, really hard to get access to, right? And it's a really, really small benefit. And so there's a sense in which like the process of going through, sort of and becoming, sort of gaining certification to receive food stamps is sort of almost its own means test. It's a little bit outside of this model, but it's like, it's like a queuing or like some sort of like very, very strong, like active, sort of work to gain access. And it's like the people who show up and like pay that cost to participate are signaling their need again through their behavior. And indeed, right, like, the shadow value of transferring some, some welfare to them, or some surplus to them rather, is probably such high in welfare terms that we could actually make food stamps programs much larger. This also has bearing on how we think about sort of inequality on marketplace platforms. And then, as promised, this is shaped in a lot my thinking about, NFT mints and other sorts of community building processes in the crypto world. Indeed, it's shaped in so much that we're now working on a paper that uses a lot of the same machinery and logic here to try and understand precisely what I'm about to say in more detail. Also, by the way, that queuing thing. So jointly with Shengwu Li, we're also trying to understand that. So when you have a world where some people have high value for money and other people have high value for time, you can use queuing as a way of screening the people with high value for the good, high value for money, but low value for time. And so that now the cross correlation between the value for money and value for time becomes relevant. But so, a very non-random example, Jenkins the Valet is having their Bored and Dangerous mint next week. This is an extremely non-random example. I'm very good friends with the people who run this project. We have a bunch of joint projects in progress. And moreover, they're an a16z portfolio companies. This is emphatically not a random example. It is also not investment advice. I'm only here to talk about their auction mechanism. So they're running a, market clearing Dutch auction, which is actually sort of like a, also pretty interesting. They're beautiful and very sophisticated contract doing a full clearing price auction with automatic refunds. There's also some interesting stuff there. But like many projects, they also have a whitelist, in this case, the right list, where they're selling the goods at a discount. And this is going to several different sets of individuals. These are people who, own their original NFT collection, who were involved in the production of the book Bored and Dangerous, or who, sort of engaged in puzzle and other competitions inside of their community, sort of showing effort and interest and engagement. And in fact, there's actually sort of three phases. So there's a public sale, the right list sale, and then a free claim for all, sort of a price zero for all of their original NFT series holders. And this setup, it's a little bit abstracted from the world of the model, of course, but it's actually very much the same sort of idea, right? Like here, we have different individuals. Like this is label revealed inequality. We have individuals with different welfare weights that we place on having them sort of remain in the community and get access to the new good, right? Like sort of highest rank is the community of people who are the writer's room and sort of contributed to writing the book. Next are, people who are either actively engaged in the community or who were involved in licensing and sort of contributing intellectual property to the book. And then there's the public, where we have sort of no ability to screen other than on price. And you've got the prices exactly sort of structured, in the way that the model would predict that you should under the optimal mechanism. That you sort of, you're essentially giving a discount to the agents that you have special welfare reasons to want to include and thus care about their welfare. Willingness to pay revealed inequality actually does happen in these contexts as well. Although I've looked around, I couldn't find a specific instance that had actually been used. Although I've seen there are a number of projects that had talked about doing a mechanism that's actually very close to the middle type goods, where they basically have a clearing price auction at the start. So there's like assortative matching on price, clearing price or pay as bid descending auction at the start. So assortative matching on price with probability of getting the good equal to 1, then like a mint for their community at some reduced price, and then an open mint at an even lower price of all the remaining objects. And so you have precisely the price gradient that would be sort of set out by that last example I showed you. You can mint with certainty at some clearing price. You can mint, if you're in the group of active and engaged community members at some lower price, it's sort of like middle quality, if you will. And then, there's a sort of a frenzy at the end at some low market clearing price where you sort of know you're getting rationed. All right, so that is our story for today. We've proposed a model of optimal allocation under general redistributive concerns. We've sort of saw the correlation between the welfare weights and the elicitable and observable information is what drives like whether you want to do redistributive allocation. And it also matters very much how revenue collected by the mechanism is used. Like, to what extent does revenue substitute for doing redistribution through this specific market? Excuse me. And again, and this is, I think, very general and extremely not limited to this particular market design context. The key dynamic is that we're using the observables and even more importantly, agents' behavior, like what they reveal about their welfare weight from their behavior in the market. Again, we've scratched the surface and how this ties into crypto applications specifically, but I do think there's a real sense in which in markets where participants are mostly pseudonymous, this is a particularly important thing to be able to do. We really do actually want to be using all the information we can get from people's behavior to try and understand, sort of what their contribution to social welfare, to our community, to an open source product, whatever it is worth. All right. QED, and happy to chat a little bit more with questions. Thanks so much.
Scott, maybe just to connect the dots a little bit more,
Please.
the mapping between your model and results in the NFT mint examples. So like for the Jenkins example, was that a case where like Lambda in effect was known? Was even almost like defined by the designer?
Yeah, so Lambda is mostly defined by the groups. So like, so I would think of, they've assigned, or they have an average. Yeah, it's maybe yes and maybe no. I think of them as thinking they know the average Lambda, which is an assumption of the model, right? That we can compute Lambda bar, for each group. Like you don't know precisely who in your community of people who license intellectual property are the ones you're most excited about bringing into your Azerbalo world, but you can infer that those are like more likely on the margin to be people who have high social contribution. And so I think of them as knowing the averages, but not necessarily the individuals' lambdas. So that's actually like precisely how we set it up in the model.
That makes sense. That makes sense. And then probably I'm just being like slow with a change of variable here. But so the trying to connect like what you said about the partitioning quality space into like 3 intervals and and then versus sort of like some of the examples in a T-mint where you have stages of like reduced prices.
Yeah.
Is that just like a change?
So Q here, I would think of it in an NFT mint. So you could actually do it where you sell different qualities, right? So I've seen a few projects proposed, but nobody actually do a process where if you mint earlier in the auction process, you have a higher probability of getting a rare or something of the sort. But when I'm thinking of this here, Q is more like your probability of being able to buy successfully, or like maybe the number of units you have access to or something like that. So in the case of Jenkins, like Q is 1, sort of like, or you buy with certainty each time you buy in the auction. You also actually get to buy with certainty in that middle category. But then like if there were a cleanup step, that would be like you're buying with some probability below 1 because everyone's trying to buy at the same time.
Okay, this makes sense. So basically, I mean, you always, right? So I should think like stage 2 and stage 3 both are kind of like over demanded, like many more people sort of like try, right? And so then the point is it's just going to be the third stage, it'll be a lower price, it'll be a larger population, it'll be a smaller probability of being a winner. And so that's the
Exactly.
Excellent.
Questions like NFT mints, like in these cases where like in stages 2 and 3 of less quality, doesn't like gas fees like raise the price to what it would be in stage 1 and kind of mess things up a bit? Yeah,
it's true. I very sneakily, the very last minute, changed a word in this slide to exactly avoid that concern. So the way you would really want to do this is a descending auction with a fixed price lottery at the end, rather than a fixed price sale at an instant. I agree. So like the something that is totally outside of this model at the moment is anything resembling a gas fee. And we've seen repeatedly that probabilistic mints at far, with rationing at far below market clearing prices have found market clearing prices in gas fees instead. But I think you could do this in practice if you did it via a lottery, that people just have like a long-term sign up. You sort of at the end of round 2 announce, okay, this is the number of units available. You have 2 days to sign our lottery list, and then we're just going to draw the randomness for you. You might, and indeed, you're just like generally good lottery etiquette for people who are like good on-chain lottery etiquette for people who are, watching this in the future. You're going to probably want to cause people to escrow so that they can't create, infinitely many lottery accounts, and so that you know that you have the value in place to call in exchange for the mint.
Questions for Scott? Awesome. Thank you, Scott.
Thank you so much.